The setting of Angel's Rest. In the heart of South Carolina's low country, where the swamps seem to breathe and the Spanish moss hangs from ancient oaks like shrouds over unmarked graves, there once stood a place whispered about in fearful tones, Angel's Rest Chapel. It was not listed on official maps, and no road signs marked the way. Instead, its name spread in hushed conversations passed between fugitives and the desperate, growing in legend with every retelling. By day, the swamplands shimmered with oppressive humidity, giving the air a syrupy thickness that clung to the skin. At night, the stillness settled like a veil broken only by the distant cry of "Whip poor wills" and the slow murmur of unseen waters. But beneath that deceptive calm lay one of the most diabolical secrets in early American history. Between 1789 and 1832, more than 200 souls vanished after seeking refuge at Angel's Rest. These were not soldiers lost in battle, nor victims of natural disaster. They were men, women, and children, primarily those fleeing enslavement who believed they were walking towards salvation. Instead, they entered a place carefully designed to harvest their desperation and profit from their suffering. For decades, their disappearances were dismissed as isolated tragedies attributed to the dangers of escape or the cruelty of slave catchers. No one imagined that the very sanctuary they sought might be the trap itself. That changed in 1923, when during the renovation of a historical archive in Charleston, a sealed crate of church records from Angel's Rest was accidentally unboxed. What lay inside stunned the handful of historians who viewed it before the state intervened. Neatly written in elegant script were baptismal registries, death records, and sermon outlines, ordinary on the surface. But attached to these were detailed ledgers, medical correspondences, and letters from institutions as far north as Philadelphia and Boston, all indicating the systematic acquisition and sale of human bodies under the guise of divine mercy. At the center of it all was one name that appeared repeatedly stamped in wax and signed in bold penmanship, Gabriel Whitworth. The documents revealed that the chapel, rather than being a haven for the lost, had functioned as the nerve center for one of the most horrifying enterprises in the antebellum South. The killings were not random. They were catalogued, timed, and calculated for maximum profit and minimum risk. The entire operation had been disguised under the cloak of religious zealotry, exploiting the vulnerable faith of those seeking freedom. State authorities, fearing the societal upheaval that might arise from revealing such a scandal, rooted in respected religious and medical institutions, sealed the findings immediately. But whispers persisted. Locals told tales of strange lights in the woods of family members who vanished after visiting the chapel, and of eerie chanting heard at night beneath the cypress canopy. What was once dismissed as folklore began to resemble a suppressed truth. Now, nearly 2 centuries later, the legacy of Angel's Rest Chapel demands to be examined not as a myth, but as a case study in how evil can flourish when cloaked in virtue. The land where it stood remains untouched, its foundations consumed by roots and time, but its horrors embedded in the soil. The shadows of its victims call out not just for remembrance, but for reckoning. And in uncovering their stories, we come face to face with the most chilling question of all. How many other sanctuaries were never exposed? The Witworth family. At the center of the Angel's Rest nightmare was the Whitworth family, a lineage that wielded charm, status, and theological rhetoric as expertly as they wielded chains, scalpels, and ledgers. Gabriel Whitworth, the patriarch, was a man who embodied southern nobility on the surface, but whose heart had long since fossilized into something darker. Standing over 6 feet tall with prematurely silver hair and pale icy blue eyes, Gabriel commanded attention in every room he entered. His presence was magnetic, his voice a potent tool that could rouse congregations to tears or reduce dissenters to silence. Born into the declining aristocracy of Virginia's planter class, Gabriel had witnessed firsthand the collapse of his family's wealth following the Revolutionary War. While others mourned their losses, Gabriel schemed, recognizing that in the post-war chaos lay the perfect opportunity to rebuild his empire, this time without moral constraint. His marriage to Constance Napton, a delicate beauty from Charleston's old money, sealed his return to power. Constance had the appearance of a porcelain angel, pale skin, raven hair, and soft hands untouched by labor, but behind her refined exterior flickered the dim light of a soul deeply fractured. Those who gazed too long into her distant brown eyes often remarked that she seemed to be observing the world from behind a veil, as though some part of her had long since retreated inward to escape the horror around her. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words often carried the hollow cadence of rehearsed pleasantries, masking a growing madness nurtured by decades of complicity. Their children, molded by a blend of intelligence, cruelty, and religious dogma, were each uniquely terrifying. Ezekiel, the eldest, at 24, was groomed to inherit the empire. He possessed his father's commanding intellect, but without the restraint of charm. His cruelty was efficient, devoid of hesitation or remorse. Gabriel trusted Ezekiel to handle the delicate aspects of their operations, interrogations, eliminations, and the identification of high-value targets. Miriam, 2 years younger, was his counterpoint. Where Ezekiel used force, Miriam wielded kindness like a blade. Her ability to appear nurturing, even angelic, made her the perfect lure. Desperate fugitives found comfort in her presence, never realizing they were being handed over to death, with a smile and a prayer. The twins Cain and Abel had just turned 20 when the family's crimes reached their peak. Cain, broad-shouldered and physically intimidating, managed the logistics, transporting captives, disposing of remains, and maintaining the infrastructure of terror. Abel, thinner and colder, was the record keeper, a bureaucrat of evil who logged every victim with meticulous precision. The youngest, Lilith, only 16 at the time, was still in training. Gabriel saw in her the potential to one day replace Miriam, a girl whose icy stare and calculating silence unnerved even seasoned allies. By the age of 18, she would become one of the most efficient and remorseless operatives in the entire network. Supporting them were Gabriel's 2 younger brothers. Michael, the plantation overseer, balanced field brutality with administrative savvy. He managed both crops and corpses with equal dispassion, assisted occasionally by his twin daughters, Grace and Mercy, whose education in family theology began in early adolescence. Then there was Raphael, who styled himself Serif, the family's resident doctor. Trained in medicine at the University of Edinburgh, Serif never practiced healing. Instead, he specialized in keeping victims alive just long enough to extract every last word, every last heartbeat of usefulness. Together, this family formed a cult of blood masquerading as a dynasty of faith. Their home, Seraphim's Grace, was not a plantation, it was a cathedral of cruelty. And every member of the Whitworth line from the pious to the passive helped sanctify the machinery of death that operated beneath their chapel floor. The creation of the Order of Fallen Angels. The Whitworths knew that brute force alone would never conceal the scale of their operation. To maintain secrecy and legitimacy, they needed ideology, something that could cloak their savagery in sanctity. Thus was born the Order of Fallen Angels, a religious movement Gabriel presented to the community as a revivalist offshoot of Methodism. But beneath its surface, message of redemption and spiritual healing, lay a carefully crafted theology of cruelty. The order claimed that true salvation could only be achieved through suffering which conveniently the Whitworths would be pleased to administer. The order held weekly services at Angel's Rest Chapel, attracting a small but devoted congregation of locals and nearby planters. Gabriel's sermons were electrifying performances brimming with Old Testament fury and New Testament compassion twisted into horrifying new forms. He preached of divine justice, of fallen angels, given one final chance to reclaim grace through pain. His charisma seduced those who heard him, and his theological sophistication gave his twisted doctrines the veneer of scriptural authority. For the enslaved and the broken, the chapel was a mirage of hope. For the privileged, it was an eccentric spiritual novelty, something to gossip about, admire, but never question. To outsiders, the Whitworths appeared to be noble religious reformers bringing order to a chaotic frontier. But within the secret meetings of the order, a more sinister agenda was discussed. Gabriel began developing a network of like-minded planters, merchants and clergy who were seduced by both his theology and his business model. The idea of profiting from the very souls that society deemed disposable was more than appealing. It was irresistible. The Whitworths weaponized myth and hope alike. They planted carefully crafted rumors in the slave quarters of plantations from Georgia to Virginia. Stories of a safe haven called Angel's Rest, where fugitives could find food sanctuary and guidance northward, began to circulate. These tales were shockingly detailed, complete with maps, coded phrases, and glowing testimonials, all forged by Abel and spread through Gabriel's informants. Miriam and Lilith played the parts of angelic saviors. And so the trap was set not with chains, but with gospel. The creation of the Order of Fallen Angels allowed the Whitworths to justify the unjustifiable. To the world they were evangelists, to their victims they were saviors, but in truth they were executioners cloaked in Scripture. They didn't just murder the body, they desecrated the soul in the name of divine justice, and worse still, they convinced others to join them. Architecture of horror. Seraphim's Grace Plantation was not simply a farm, it was a fortress of calculated horror, designed with precision to serve both function and façade. At the center stood the main house, a grand 3-story Georgian mansion, resting atop a slight hill, its columns whitewashed and windows gleaming in the Carolina sun. To visiting neighbors, it projected the elegance and prosperity expected of a successful planter family. But this was a carefully constructed illusion. The true machinery of terror operated out of view in the surrounding buildings and beneath the very floorboards of its chapel. Angel's Rest Chapel, completed in 1788, was unlike any other house of worship in the region. Though modest in outward appearance, Its interior was crafted with dark mahogany, blood-red stained glass, and chilling depictions of divine vengeance rather than mercy. Gabriel had commissioned secret alterations during its construction modifications, known only to the family and a few loyal workers. Behind the altar, hidden behind a carved panel of the Archangel Michael defeating Satan, was a trapdoor leading to a basement unlike any other. This underground chamber contained 5 cells, initially each lined with thick stone and reinforced iron doors. Soundproofed with layers of clay and fabric, the cells ensured that no screams would rise to the chapel above even during Sunday service. Serif's adjoining laboratory was a hybrid of surgical suite and torture chamber. It held everything from bone saws and scalpels to chemical compounds used to prolong consciousness during extreme pain. In this room, victims were not only broken, they were studied. Adjacent to the chapel stood what appeared to be a simple outbuilding for hymnals and church vestment. In reality, it was Serif's supply depot, a place where bodies were preserved, tagged, and prepared for shipment to distant medical institutions. Abel catalogued every detail, ensuring that each corpse could be traced back to a victim file that included age, physical traits, confessions extracted, and final method of death. As the years progressed, the facility expanded. The chapel basement doubled in size to accommodate 12 cells. A kiln was installed, disguised as a pottery oven to incinerate remains that couldn't be sold or whose identities posed a risk. Cain managed these logistics with the cold efficiency of an engineer. He oversaw repairs, burial pits, and transport systems designed to make death a conveyor belt of profit. Even the plantation's roads were laid out to facilitate concealment. A winding path through ancient live oaks led from the main house to the chapel-masking movement at all hours. Storage sheds hid wagons modified to carry corpses beneath bales of rice or crates of gospel tracts. Every detail from the airflow in the basement cells to the placement of lanterns along the trails had been considered. Seraphim's grace was not merely the stage for horror, it was the instrument. It was a structure designed to murder invisibly, quietly, and with complete impunity. And like all great instruments of evil, it performed its work beautifully. The Deception Network. The Whitworths were not merely killers. They were strategists, and their deadliest weapon was not the scalpel, the sermon, or the noose. It was narrative. From the beginning, the family understood that the key to sustained success wasn't just brutality, it was belief. And belief required a story, compelling enough to mask a genocide. Through their order of fallen angels, the Whitworths spun a web of deception so elaborate that it ensnared the desperate and the powerful alike. Gabriel was the architect of this mythos. He knew that fugitives from slavery were desperate for hope, any hope. So he gave them a story tailored to their dreams. A chapel hidden in the swamp run by kind white Methodists sympathetic to abolition. Word spread of a resting place for angels where weary travelers were fed, protected, and quietly guided to the north. The details were crafted with surgical precision, the password to offer the direction to approach the symbol carved in the chapel door. Each element made the story feel real because it was rooted in just enough truth. Miriam and Lilith were the bait. Their beauty, charm, and gentle manner disarmed suspicion. To the escapees, they appeared like saints in a world of cruelty. But behind their smiles lay ice. Every detail gleamed in these moments, names, contacts, future plans was handed to Abel, who cross-referenced the information with existing records. Meanwhile, Serif evaluated the victims for physical condition and potential market value. Michael and Cain worked the logistics. They paid informants in slave quarters, bribed local drivers, and coordinated shipments of bodies to medical schools across the eastern seaboard. Abel handled correspondence using aliases and religious euphemisms. Medical schools were told the cadavers were free persons of color who died from illness, complete with falsified documentation from Dr. Thorne or other corrupt professionals. To the world, the Whitworths were devout Methodists, generous neighbors, and upstanding citizens. They donated to churches, hosted community events, and even opened their chapel to neighboring congregations. No one questioned their piety. No one asked why strangers were sometimes seen entering the plantation but never leaving. The success of this deception lay not in hiding the truth, but in replacing it with a more palatable lie one people wanted to believe. And for over a decade, it worked flawlessly. The interrogation system. The Whitworth's system of interrogation was not an improvised act of cruelty. It was a methodical machine fine-tuned over years of experimentation and wrapped in a veneer of religious ritual. Once an escapee had been lured to Angel's Rest Chapel. Through Miriam's angelic welcome, the machinery of exploitation moved swiftly into place. Victims were never dragged to their deaths. They were invited, fed, clothed, prayed over. And while they believed they were being assessed for safe passage north, the Whitworths were calculating how to extract every last shred of information and value from their flesh and soul. Miriam's role in the early phase of this process was pivotal. Her gentle voice and attentive care gave fugitives a false sense of safety. She explained that the family's network was under constant threat, that verification was necessary to avoid betrayal. "We've lost too many already," she would say, eyes glistening with feigned sorrow. "We must be cautious. But once we know who you are, we'll do everything we can to help you." These conversations weren't interrogations in the traditional sense. They were soul-stripping dialogues carefully engineered to lower defenses and extract intel. Every name mentioned, every family member left behind, every route taken to reach the chapel was mentally recorded and later transcribed by Abel. With obsessive precision, he created cross-indexed profiles of suspected escape networks. He built maps from words roots from rumors and compiled dossiers more advanced than anything a military officer might devise. When patterns emerged, locations, accomplices, future targets, those names were passed on to professional slave catchers throughout the South. But when charm failed, pain spoke louder. Those deemed most valuable, young, healthy, and knowledgeable, were transferred to the chapel basement for extended verification. Serif Whitworth took over at this point. No stranger to anatomy, he believed suffering could be a form of sacred revelation. To Serif, pain was a truth serum, and his victims were both subjects and specimens. His goal was not merely to force confessions, but to do so while maintaining the body's market value. The more intact the cadaver, the higher the price it would fetch at medical schools. Each cell in the basement was designed to preserve a victim's life, just long enough to extract what the family needed. Ventilation systems regulated temperature and oxygen flow. Feeding tubes and carefully administered hydration ensured prisoners remained alive even through days of torment. Serif used surgical tools, pressure point manipulation, and even psychological disorientation techniques far ahead of his time, Unlike torturers who relied on brute force, Seraph understood how to fragment the human will piece by piece. Kane ensured the facilities remained operational while Abel took notes during sessions recording the interrogations, not for justice, but for optimization. Which techniques yielded results faster? Which routes were most consistently mentioned? The Whitworths weren't merely harvesting pain, they were refining their methods. The process typically lasted 3 to 5 days. When all information had been extracted, or when a victim's health began to deteriorate, the final decision was made: cremation, burial, or preservation and sale. Some bodies were shipped north, identified with forged death certificates. Others, deemed too dangerous to leave behind, were incinerated or buried deep in the swamp. Lilith, growing into her role during these years, began assisting with female captives, her apparent innocence, allowing her to manipulate maternal victims with chilling ease. This system turned Angel's Rest into a spiritual slaughterhouse. But unlike other sites of historical atrocity, there were no mass graves, no mass shootings, no open rebellion. Only silence. Because every victim walked into the chapel, willingly guided by hope and welcomed with scripture. And every scream that followed was muffled by stone and sanctimony, expansion, and the Southern Redemption Society. By the mid-1790s, the Whitworth operation had grown far beyond the confines of a single plantation. What began as a horrifyingly efficient local scheme was now evolving into a broader conspiracy, one that blended religion, commerce, and violence into an unholy trinity. Gabriel Whitworth, ever the strategist, knew that the system he'd created, luring the desperate under the guise of salvation and converting their bodies into profit, could not only be replicated but franchised. And so he seeded a secret society among Southern elites, the Southern Redemption Society. At first, its members were carefully selected, fellow planters with cruel pragmatism, doctors willing to look the other way, or better yet eager to participate, slave catchers who valued information more than morality. Even ministers corrupted not by wealth alone, but by Gabriel's seductive theology of predestination. In Gabriel's twisted worldview, those fleeing slavery were not innocent, they were damned. Their escape was rebellion against the divine order. To process them, he reasoned, was not murder, but mercy. And for those who already believed slavery was sanctioned by Scripture, his sermons offered the perfect justification to act without guilt. The society grew rapidly. Monthly gatherings were held at rotating estates, often disguised as religious revivals or philanthropic retreats. Members brought with them profits to tithe dues, essentially derived from any activities connected to the society's system. These funds were used to bribe officials, silence whistleblowers, and build new facilities. It wasn't long before similar false sanctuaries began to appear in Georgia, North Carolina, and parts of Virginia, each inspired by Angel's Rest, each claiming to offer sanctuary to the enslaved, each feeding the same grisly network. New members were indoctrinated into Gabriel's theological justifications. He held seminars not just on logistics, but on divine law. Scripture was dissected, reinterpreted, and weaponized. Attendees left these meetings not just emboldened, they left righteous. The idea that torture and murder could be acts of divine justice was no longer shocking. It was systematic. To support the expansion, the society recruited allies across industries. Dr. Edmund Thorne of Charleston became one of the most important. His medical credentials gave him authority to issue death certificates and consult with anatomy professors in the North. His involvement helped create the illusion that the cadavers shipped out of Seraphim's grace were natural deaths, unfortunate but legitimate. Captain Marcus Fulton was another key figure. A professional slave catcher, he developed an extensive surveillance network throughout the Carolinas and Georgia, targeting fugitives based on intelligence funneled through the Whitworth files. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the involvement of Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a circuit-riding Methodist minister, who once preached against the sin of rebellion. Blackwood became a spiritual enabler of the society. He comforted families of the disappeared, performed false funerals, and blessed the society's endeavors as part of a divine war against chaos. His words lent spiritual armor to atrocities. With this network in place, Gabriel's vision transformed from a family-run horror into a region-wide machine. Slave catchers were now armed with precise intelligence. Medical schools were supplied with an endless stream of specimens. Planters shared techniques not for farming, but for interrogation. And all the while, the story of Angel's Rest was whispered from one plantation to another, always framed as hope. By the time Morrison's investigation began, the Southern Redemption Society had become a shadow government of cruelty. It didn't fly a flag or write laws, but it operated with a terrifying consistency. Its victims were invisible, its allies respectable, and its crimes sanctified. And perhaps most horrifying of all, no one outside its circle suspected a thing: the Underground Railroad attacked. While most abolitionists believed their enemies to be slave catchers, corrupt sheriffs, or hostile plantation owners, few suspected that the greatest threat to the Underground Railroad was hiding beneath the robes of religion and the pillars of piety. The Whitworth family and the Southern Redemption Society had evolved from a local horror into a covert intelligence operation, and their most devastating target became the very system that was trying to free the enslaved. The Underground Railroad, a fragile, decentralized web of hope, was systematically infiltrated, compromised, and decimated by the information harvested from the victims of Angel's Rest. Gabriel Whitworth understood that information was more valuable than gold. Each new arrival to the chapel was treated not just as a victim, but as a data point. Every whispered confession, every name uttered in trust, every anecdote about safe houses and conductors was carefully extracted and recorded. Abel Whitworth had built a cross-referenced archive more advanced than anything Southern law enforcement possessed. It was an evolving map of the Underground Railroad's most sensitive arteries: names, routes, hand signals, code, phrases, and meeting points. This intelligence was not hoarded, it was sold. The society established partnerships with the most brutal slave catchers in the South, offering them actionable intelligence in exchange for a share of the rewards. These weren't just bounty hunters, they were precision instruments of terror. With the Whitworth data in hand, they no longer had to search blindly through forests and marshes. They could intercept escapees en route to their safe havens. Entire convoys of freedom seekers were ambushed mere miles from sanctuary. Families were torn apart just before crossing into northern states, and worst of all, the railroad itself began to lose trust in its own pathways. The society's methods were insidious. A captured escapee might be tortured into revealing the identity of a conductor. That conductor, now unknowingly compromised, would lead others into traps. A safe house, once secure, could become a killing ground within days. Because the Underground Railroad lacked a central structure, these breaches were hard to track. From the outside, it looked like bad luck. In reality, it was the deliberate dismantling of a moral resistance movement. Some of the most successful raids were even traced back to stories deliberately seeded by the society itself. Gabriel and his agents would spread rumors of a new route or unknown sanctuary, guiding fugitives to a false haven under the control of the society. These setups became so effective that in some months more escapees arrived at Angel's Rest than at any legitimate northern station. The society didn't just intercept the railroad, they hijacked it. This assault had a chilling effect on abolitionist networks. Conductors in Maryland and Delaware began reporting that they'd lost contact with escapees routed through South Carolina. Others stopped taking in fugitives altogether, fearing exposure. The emotional toll was catastrophic. Former slaves now free watched helplessly as friends and loved ones disappeared. Hope, the very fuel of the Underground Railroad, began to flicker. And yet the worst irony of all was this: while abolitionists risked their lives in secret, the society operated openly under the guise of religious revival. Their crimes were buried beneath sermons, their torture chambers consecrated with psalms. They prayed over their victims before extracting their souls. In this war for freedom, the most dangerous weapon was not the whip or the rifle, but the pulpit, Samuel Washington's infiltration. By 1799, whispers of a place called Angel's Rest had begun reaching free black communities in the North, not as a sanctuary, but as a void. Stories of people who had set out for South Carolina and were never heard from again were becoming too frequent to ignore. Among those listening was Jeremiah Morrison, a Quaker abolitionist who had spent years documenting the Underground Railroad. But Morrison knew that no amount of northern inquiry would penetrate the veil of respectability surrounding the Whitworth family. What he needed was someone who could slip beneath that veil unnoticed. That man was Samuel Washington. Washington was not just courageous, he was uniquely qualified. A free black man from Baltimore with a formal education in Pennsylvania, Washington, had already risked his life infiltrating plantations in Virginia and Maryland. Light-skinned and eloquent, he could pose as a mixed-race house slave or an educated fugitive with ease. More importantly, he had the mental discipline and emotional intelligence required to survive under deep cover. When asked if he would risk everything to enter Angel's Rest, his answer was quiet and immediate. Yes. If they are killing our people under God's name, someone has to walk into the fire. In March 1799, Washington arrived in Charleston under the guise of a fugitive seeking refuge. He worked as a laborer for several weeks, allowing rumors of his escape to circulate through underground channels. Eventually, he was approached by an informant who offered directions to Angel's Rest Chapel, complete with passwords and instructions. He followed them. When Miriam Whitworth opened the chapel door, she was everything the stories had described: radiant, soft-spoken, and angelic. "You poor soul," she whispered as she took his hand and led him into the chapel. Inside, Washington was greeted with clean clothes, warm food, and the illusion of safety. The other supposed seekers were quiet, nervous, and strange. Many avoided eye contact, and their vague stories didn't add up. Still, Washington kept his cover, observing everything: the layout of the buildings, the behavior of the family, the quiet sounds at night that hinted at something horrible beneath the floor. On the third night, Washington heard their muffled cries rising from the chapel floorboards. By the fourth, he knew without a doubt this was no sanctuary. It was a slaughterhouse. But before he could escape, he was discovered. Abel Whitworth had been watching him. On Gabriel's orders, Washington was dragged into the basement, shackled and prepared for interrogation. The hunter had become the prey. What followed was a nightmare. Sheriff Whitworth applied his full arsenal of torture methods to Washington, convinced the man was part of a larger abolitionist plot. But Washington was trained for this. Through searing pain, he fed them a mixture of lies and half-truths, stalling for time and looking for a way out. That chance came from the most unlikely of sources, Grace Whitworth Michael's 13-year-old daughter. Disturbed by what she saw, Grace began speaking with Washington during her visits, and he planted doubts in her mind, gently, persistently, and with theological logic. "Does your God really want this?" he asked her once. Her silence spoke volumes. Grace agreed to help. She promised to unlock his cell during her next visit, but their plan failed. Her twin Mercy had noticed the shift in her sister's behavior and reported it. When Washington attempted to escape, Abel was waiting. The punishment would be severe. But what Gabriel and his family didn't realize was that Samuel Washington had already achieved his mission. He had confirmed the truth, mapped the horror, and planted a seed of rebellion in their own bloodline. The chapel raid. While Washington suffered in the basement of Angel's Rest, Jeremiah Morrison had grown increasingly alarmed by his prolonged silence. Knowing the risks Washington faced, Morrison decided to act. Quietly, he gathered a group of trusted allies, Quaker abolitionists from Philadelphia, and free black volunteers from Charleston. With weeks of planning, they mapped out a full-scale raid on the plantation. Timing would be critical. They had only one shot to break through the Witworth's illusion of righteousness and expose the truth to the world. At dawn on a fog-drenched June morning, Morrison's team struck. They used a diversionary fire to draw attention to the rice fields while slipping into the chapel through a hidden path Washington had previously described. What they found beneath the chapel shook even the most hardened among them. There were 12 cells, 8 of them occupied by barely living victims. The walls were stained with blood, the air choked with rot. Some prisoners were too weak to speak. Others cried with relief. Samuel Washington was there, half-conscious but alive, his body bearing the marks of surgical torture. In Sheriff's laboratory, the team found journals, hundreds of pages, documenting methods of torture, psychological manipulation, and anatomical observations. There were also files, victim logs, shipping receipts, and correspondence with medical institutions. Gabriel had kept everything. For him, record-keeping was part of the theology. The ledgers would become the most damning evidence of all. Over 800 victims, each one documented, numbered, and reduced to commodity. The team barely escaped. As the fire was extinguished and the Whitworths realized what had happened, Morrison's men vanished into the swamps with their rescued prisoners and stolen documents. Though many would never recover from what they endured, their testimonies combined with the written evidence would break the illusion of Angel's Rest forever. Yet the legal system proved far less responsive. Local authorities, many of whom were connected to Gabriel through politics or church, dismissed the findings as abolitionist propaganda. Federal authorities lacked jurisdiction. Morrison published everything he could in abolitionist newspapers across the North, hoping exposure would be enough. and in many ways it was. The horrors of Angel's Rest galvanized the abolitionist movement like few events ever had. But the society didn't die. Gabriel and his family fled selling Seraphim's Grace and vanishing into Alabama. The Southern Redemption Society closed its doors in public but merely changed names in private. The machine would continue elsewhere. Yet Morrison's raid planted a crucial seed of national awareness. The Underground Railroad began to rebuild this time with better safeguards and more suspicion, and Samuel Washington, once a tortured prisoner, became a living symbol of resistance. His scars, both physical and spiritual, became his testimony. His name, once spoken in the basement of a chapel built for death, would now echo in the halls of northern churches, where his story was retold not as tragedy, but as proof that darkness once named could be fought. Legacy of terror. The exposure of the Whitworth family's crimes marked a turning point, not just in abolitionist history, but in America's understanding of how deeply evil could embed itself in religious institutions. The impact rippled across the North, where churches, newspapers, and public figures were forced to reckon with the reality that a respected Southern family had turned Scripture into a scalpel. But the effects were even more profound within the Underground Railroad itself. Conductors across multiple states began abandoning old routes. Entire networks had to be restructured with new safeguards and screening measures. The names and safe houses compromised by Whitworth records could no longer be trusted. For every victim the Whitworths tortured, dozens more were indirectly endangered. The Underground Railroad, once a fragile chain of faith and courage, now bore scars from betrayal that would never fully heal. But amidst this devastation, something powerful emerged: resolve. Abolitionists now had a rallying cry rooted not in ideology, but in evidence. The details in Morrison's ledgers and Washington's testimony were irrefutable. Northern Christians, once indifferent or undecided, found themselves confronted by the reality of evil cloaked in Christian language. Sermons across Boston, Philadelphia, and New York condemned the perversion of the gospel at Angel's Rest. Religious neutrality was no longer an option. The South, however, responded with fury and deflection. Prominent planters called the raid a Northern hoax. Newspapers in Charleston accused Morrison of fabricating his documents to incite rebellion. Some Southern churches doubled down, praising Gabriel as a misunderstood visionary. But even among the faithful, whispers of doubt began to grow. What if it were true? What if these sanctuaries of salvation were really slaughterhouses? And then there was Grace Whitworth. She had risked everything to help Washington escape. Though still a child, she had broken the chain of obedience that bound her family together. Rumors circulated that she later fled to the North under a false name, eventually becoming a teacher in Ohio. Her story was never confirmed, but her presence was felt whenever the question arose. Can anyone born into evil choose something better? Seraphim's Grace, once the beating heart of the operation, was abandoned. The plantation house crumbled, the chapel burned, and the swamp began reclaiming what had been stolen. But beneath the vines and rot, the cells remained intact, a silent graveyard for the forgotten. The Whitworths fled west, but they left behind a wound in the American conscience, one that would fester for decades. For the first time, the North had proof that slavery was not just an economic system, it was a moral cancer. And the cure would not come through policy or patience, but through confrontation. The legacy of Angel's Rest was horror. But in its ashes, the fire of resistance burned brighter. Historical silence. Despite the horror revealed during the raid on Seraphim's Grace, much of the Whitworth family's full story remains buried both figuratively and literally. Local officials sealed many of the documents recovered during the rescue operation, citing public safety and fear of social unrest. Some files mysteriously disappeared from evidence lockers. Others were relocated to sealed state archives, never opened again. Historians trying to piece together the full scope of the Whitworth operation run into dead ends, missing testimony, and a persistent Southern reluctance to reopen old wounds. The land itself resists excavation, though ground-penetrating radar has confirmed the existence of underground chambers beneath the ruins of the chapel and main house. Modern archaeological investigations are routinely blocked by legal disputes over property rights or vague declarations of historical preservation. Locals refer to the site as cursed. Teenagers who dare to visit report hearing whispers at night or seeing faces in the fog. Whether superstition or psychological residue, the place exudes memory like a wound that refuses to close. Even more disturbing are the echoes found outside of South Carolina. Ship manifests from ports in Texas, Louisiana, and Mexico contain familiar aliases linked to the Whitworth. Anatomical specimens with similar surgical markings appear in European medical catalogues years after the Alabama operation was exposed. And in obscure letters from missionaries or medical students, vague references to experiments conducted in the name of the angels crop up like poison in forgotten footnotes. The silence surrounding the Whitworth is not the silence of ignorance, it is the silence of suppression. Too many people had too much to lose. Judges, clergy, and academics had all benefited from the machine Gabriel built. To condemn it publicly would mean admitting how complicit society had become, and so the silence lingers. It protects the powerful, it erases the dead. But silence is not forgetfulness. The story survives because survivors passed it down, not through official history books, but through whispered stories, hidden journals, and the courage of abolitionists who refused to let the truth die. In every unnamed grave, in every burned page, the echoes remain. The question is no longer whether it happened. The question is, how many others were never found? Historical silence. What is most haunting about the story of the Whitworth family is not only what was uncovered, but what was allowed to remain hidden. The scale of the crimes committed at Seraphim's Grace and later at New Seraphim in Alabama was staggering. Yet despite overwhelming evidence, ledgers, testimonies, physical remains, and even confessions, most of the perpetrators escaped justice. And in the years that followed, a profound and deliberate silence fell over their legacy. This was not the silence of mourning. It was the silence of political survival. Southern leaders fearing the social upheaval such revelations might cause quickly moved to contain the fallout. Church officials quietly distanced themselves from the Whitworth name, but made no public statements condemning their theology. Territorial judges in Alabama dismissed the evidence as inadmissible, citing states' rights and constitutional overreach. Even northern institutions, including some of the medical schools that had received cadavers from the family, issued only vague denials and refused to cooperate with further investigation. Files went missing, witnesses recanted, and the surviving members of the Southern Redemption Society faded into new identities, new professions, new crimes. By the mid-19th century, The name Whitworth had all but disappeared from the public record. In history, textbooks, there was no mention of the order of fallen angels, no reference to angels' rest, no investigation of the network of fake sanctuaries that had once stretched across 4 states. The atrocities were buried not only in the earth, but in bureaucracy. Local archives sealed evidence indefinitely. Requests by journalists and historians were denied under the vague justification of protecting public stability. Even within abolitionist circles, the memory of the Whitworth crimes was gradually overshadowed by newer horrors, slave auctions, lynching, war. The scale of Southern violence was so vast that one massacre, no matter how calculated, began to blur into the wider fabric of brutality. And yet among those who knew the silence was never comfortable. Some tried to speak out. In the 1840s, a small group of Quakers published a series of anonymous pamphlets recounting the events of Seraphim's grace. But without formal backing, their claims were dismissed as sensationalism. A generation later, one of Washington's descendants attempted to publish a memoir based on his journals, but no press would take the risk of reawakening what one editor called a settled chapter. And so the chapel bells fell silent. But the truth persisted, quietly, defiantly. In the testimony of freedmen who had lost loved ones to a promise of sanctuary, in the rumors that clung to the ruins of the plantation, in the nightmares of those who had seen what lay beneath the altar. The story was never fully lost. It was only waiting beneath moss and memory for someone to ask again. Because historical silence is not absence. It is evidence. A void carefully maintained tells us that something once stood there. Something powerful, something dangerous. And until we unearth it fully, we risk letting it rise again in another form under another name disguised by another gospel. Broader implications. The crimes of the Whitworth family cannot be understood as isolated acts of madness or the excesses of a single twisted household. Rather, they serve as a mirror reflecting the darkest capacities of society when morality is bent to serve power. The Whitworths did not operate in a vacuum. Their network thrived because it was supported actively or passively by plantation, culture, religious institutions, political leaders, and even the scientific community. What the Whitworths created was not just a system of torture and murder. It was a philosophy. They turned scripture into justification, turning predestination into a license to kill. Gabriel's sermons did not merely justify brutality, they sanctified it. He taught that suffering cleansed the soul, that the damned deserved pain, and that the faithful had a divine duty to carry out that pain. These were not fringe ideas, they were built on distorted interpretations of accepted theology, weaponized in service of profit and control. This abuse of religion is perhaps the most terrifying legacy of the Whitworth Empire. It illustrates how easily sacred texts can be manipulated to excuse the inexcusable. When Gabriel claimed divine approval, few questioned him. His wealth, status, and piety made his theology persuasive. And that should terrify us, because it reminds us that atrocities often wear the robes of righteousness. Evil does not always come shouting. Sometimes it preaches. The medical implications are equally chilling. The Whitworth operation exposed a disturbing collaboration between respected academic institutions and mass murderers. Medical schools from Philadelphia to New Orleans accepted bodies without questioning their origins, despite obvious signs of trauma and falsified documentation. Some professors even requested specific injuries or anatomical conditions, effectively commissioning torture. These partnerships illustrate how scientific pursuit, when divorced from ethics, can become complicit in horror. In many ways, the Whitworths anticipated modern organized crime. Their use of coded communication, distributed networks, legal fronts, and data analytics was decades ahead of its time. Abel's record-keeping rivaled government intelligence. Miriam's psychological manipulation foreshadowed espionage techniques. Sharif's surgical experimentation anticipated the darkest chapters of 20th century medicine. These were not impulsive acts, they were calculated, efficient, and terrifyingly modern. But perhaps the most unsettling implication is the role of community complicity. The Whitworths were beloved by their neighbors. They donated to churches, hosted social events, and maintained a reputation for fairness toward their own enslaved laborers. Many who attended their Sunday services likely knew something was wrong, but they chose silence, chose comfort, chose to believe the lie. This is the true lesson of the Whitworth story. Atrocity requires infrastructure. It thrives not just on cruelty, but on compliance, on the willingness of good people to look away, to rationalize, to protect their own peace at the cost of someone else's life. In the end, the Whitworths may be gone, but their warning remains. When religion becomes a weapon, when science is stripped of conscience, when justice bows to politics, and when neighbors choose comfort over truth, then evil does not need to hide. It will kneel at the altar, and it will pray. The complete truth may never be known. For all that was uncovered, ledgers, testimonies, remains, journals, the full extent of the Whitworth crimes will likely never be known. The Southern Redemption Society operated in shadows, and the deeper one peers into those shadows, the more indistinct the boundaries become. What began as a single family's twisted theology metastasized into a multi-state network with dozens of silent participants and even more silent victims. The historical record, even at its most comprehensive, is but a fragment of the whole. Many victims of the Whitworths were never recorded. They were too poor, too transient, too invisible in the eyes of the society that enabled their disappearance. Some were never even named. Escapees who vanished en route to Angel's Rest, never making it into the ledgers. Mothers and children who were processed too quickly to be interrogated or catalogued. Others were destroyed entirely. Bodies, incinerated records, shredded traces of existence scrubbed from plantation ground and paper alike. And then there are the documents we know existed but can no longer access. Morrison's original cache included correspondences that went missing en route to Washington. Witnesses mentioned entire ledgers not included in the evidence submitted during trial. It is believed that some were intentionally destroyed during the family's exodus from South Carolina, burned in stoves, buried in marshes, or sent downriver in sealed crates, never meant to be retrieved. Compounding this erasure is the complicity of institutions tasked with preserving truth. Southern churches that supported the Whitworths refused to issue public condemnations. Political leaders denied jurisdiction or turned away federal inquiries. Medical schools that profited from the bodies remained silent, their ethics subservient to curiosity and advancement. Even Northern Archives libraries, historical societies, and universities have hesitated to fully unseal what remains of the Morrison-Washington files, often citing contextual sensitivity or community impact. There's also the matter of public discomfort. The brutality of the Whitworth case is difficult to confront, particularly because it was not committed by fringe outlaws, but by respected landowners, parents, preachers, and physicians. It dismantles the myth of the Old South as a place of gentlemanly honor and forces us to face the uncomfortable truth that barbarism often hides behind the mask of civility, that the very structures of politeness, Sunday hats, Bible verses, community dinners, can be used to camouflage mass murder. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that this was not necessarily the only operation of its kind. The Southern Redemption Society was exposed only because one man, Washington, survived. How many others like him never made it out? How many Angels' Rest chapels dotted the Southern landscape under different names, run by different families with the same theology and same silence? The Witworths may have been the most documented example, but they were almost certainly not the only one. In the end, what we know about the Whitworth family is horrifying, but what we don't know may be worse. History, when distorted by power and protected by silence, becomes not a record, but a wound. One that festers beneath centuries of soil, waiting for someone with the courage to dig deeper. Archaeological evidence and global echoes. Despite the passage of over 2 centuries, the ground still remembers. In the 1990s, a small group of independent researchers, armed with ground-penetrating radar and archival blueprints of Seraphim's grace, conducted a limited archaeological survey of the land once occupied by Angels' Rest Chapel. What they found beneath layers of roots and compacted soil was staggering rectangular stone outlines matching cell dimensions. Metallic readings consistent with surgical tools and subsurface anomalies that could only be explained as burial trenches or cremation pits. The deeper they scanned, the more the land spoke. Patterns of disturbance in soil layers suggested bodies had been moved, unearthed, burned. The position and architecture of the underground chamber, confirmed by historical diagrams, matched the testimonies of Morrison's raid survivors. Yet despite these discoveries, efforts to excavate further were stalled by land disputes, hostile local politics, and a conspicuous lack of institutional interest. Some suspected quiet interference by descendants of those who had once profited from the Whitworth operation. Others feared the social unrest that might follow the unearthing of mass graves on what had become private land. But even without a full dig, the echoes of the Whitworth crimes reverberate well beyond South Carolina or Alabama. In university archives in New Orleans and Boston, anatomy records from the early 1800s contain cadaver acquisition forms signed under pseudonyms later traced back to the society. Notes in the margins describe unusual trauma patterns, eerily consistent with Serif Whitworth's journals, nerve scarring without external bruising, surgical precision on otherwise healthy bodies, and even post-mortem notes about psychological endurance. In European medical museums, preserved teaching specimens from anonymous American donors bear anatomical abnormalities, evidence of experimentation more akin to torture than science. Ship manifests from Galveston, Veracruz, and even Lisbon list names that align with aliases used by fleeing society members. Some cargo descriptions marked as medical supplies match the weight and size of preserved human remains. Letters between European physicians and their American counterparts hint at cross-Atlantic trades of such materials under the veil of academic cooperation. And then there are the stories. In Mexico, whispered legends tell of a white-haired doctor in the early 1800s who paid handsomely for strong bodies. In the deep south, tales of abandoned chapels with sealed basements persist in oral tradition, always the same pattern: sanctuary turned slaughterhouse. And in South American archives, records exist of anatomical specimens shipped from the Gulf Coast under false names, coinciding with the final years of the Society's known operations. These global traces are not conclusive on their own, but taken together, they form a terrifying suggestion that the Whitworth operation, though disrupted, may not have ended. It may have metastasized, adapting, migrating, hiding behind new facades in new lands. What began beneath a chapel in the South Carolina swamp may have seeded an international trade in human experimentation and anatomical commodification. Not a story of one family, but of a legacy that refused to die. And so the question shifts from what happened to how far did it spread? Because sometimes history doesn't vanish. It evolves. Other hidden networks. As horrifying as the Whitworth case is, what lingers most in the minds of researchers and historians is a question no one can answer with certainty. Were they truly the only ones? There is a chilling probability, one that few are willing to entertain publicly, that Angel's Rest was not an aberration, but a prototype. The Whitworths were methodical, but they were also pragmatic. Their theology was adaptable. Their logistics were teachable. Their profits were scalable. And the Southern Redemption Society by design was not a closed circle, it was an incubator. A place where like-minded individuals could study, imitate, and replicate. In this light, the Society wasn't just a network of co-conspirators. It was a franchise model of theological murder. Records recovered from the Seraphim's Grace Raid referenced at least 6 other redemption centers across Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Most were never located. Some likely collapsed on their own, but others may have operated quietly, tucked into the corners of forgotten counties or hidden behind the facade of revivalist ministries. Local legends in parts of rural Mississippi still speak of plantations where strangers were welcomed and never seen again. Small chapels with basements that no one dares open. Communities that hold secrets buried in silence, passed down, not in books, but in uneasy glances and inherited shame. Historians attempting to trace these possible sites often run into a wall of resistance. Documents missing, land deeds scrubbed, archives misplaced or reclassified. In several cases, legal threats were issued to researchers investigating church records from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The phrase "lost in the fire" appears with disturbing frequency. And while some of this may be coincidence, the pattern is too consistent to ignore. It's not just silence that protects these shadows, it's reputation. Many of the families allegedly linked to other society chapters went on to become prominent figures in Southern business politics and religious leadership. To admit their ancestors ran a killing ground disguised as a chapel would be to demolish more than legacy. It would be to admit that evil wasn't confined to the margins of society, it was built into its foundation. What little circumstantial evidence we do have points to a much broader infrastructure than the Morrison raid ever uncovered. Financial records showing unexplained donations to medical institutions. Old sermons found in church archives that echo Gabriel Whitworth's rhetoric nearly word for word. Reports of enslaved people vanishing from specific regions at significantly higher rates than average, always accompanied by rumors of healing sanctuaries or religious rest houses. It's likely that many of these operations, if they existed, collapsed under their own weight. The brutality, the secrecy, the political tensions they could only sustain so long before imploding. But the absence of direct evidence is not exoneration. The Witworth story proves one devastating truth if the right people are involved, educated, respected, well-funded. An entire system of murder can function for decades and leave almost nothing behind. Almost, because even when the buildings fall and the records are burned, the human cost remains. The names not recorded, the bodies not buried. The families who waited generations for word that never came. And if the Whitworths were not alone, then America's shadow history is deeper, darker, and far more deliberate than we've ever dared imagine. Final moral reflections. In the long, painful accounting of American history, the Whitworth case stands as something singular, not just in its brutality, but in its anatomy. Here in one story, we find every mechanism by which evil takes root and thrives. Theological distortion, institutional complicity, bureaucratic precision, and collective silence. We see not a monster, but a system, a cold, calculated operation cloaked in civility and scripture. What makes the Whitworth family so terrifying is not that they were madmen. It's that they were functional, charming, even devout. They did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were instruments of God. Gabriel's journals never once express guilt. Instead, they praise efficiency in grace. Serif's records read less like the musings of a sadist and more like a surgeon's academic journal carefully tracking which organs yielded which screams. This wasn't chaos. This was order, a perverse, holy order. And that is perhaps the greatest warning their story offers. Evil does not always announce itself with bloodied hands and wild eyes. Often it speaks with eloquence. It stands in pulpits. It wears clean clothes. It smiles as it kills. The Whitworth legacy also forces us to confront the way society responds to atrocity. Despite the evidence, most of the perpetrators walked free. They blended back into respectable society or vanished across borders. Their wealth protected them, their churches protected them, their whiteness protected them, and those who sought justice. Morris and Washington, the rescued survivors, were left with scars, trauma, and whispers. Even now, few monuments stand in their memory. No national museums list Angel's Rest among the documented horrors of slavery. School children do not learn the names of the vanished. And yet the moral question lingers. What kind of nation allows such crimes to be forgotten? But amidst this darkness, there were lights. Samuel Washington, tortured but unbroken, stood before crowds and told the truth. Grace Whitworth, a child born into cruelty, made a choice that cost her everything but saved another. Jeremiah Morrison, despite grief and isolation, kept pursuing the evidence, knowing full well the system would never thank him for it. These people, ordinary, imperfect human, are the ones who reclaimed a sliver of humanity from the abyss. And so the final reflection is, this history will not save us from repeating its worst chapters. Only memory will, only vigilance. Only the refusal to let evil wear the mask of morality again. The Whitworth story is not just a horror tale from another century. It is a blueprint of what happens when silence is chosen over truth, when faith is twisted into control, and when empathy is sacrificed at the altar of profit. Let this story remain. Let it be spoken, studied, and mourned. Because when the bells of Angel's Rest fell silent, 1,000 voices were buried, and unless we keep telling their story, they will never be heard again.